Good Monday, everybody. Welcome to Charting with Dan. I'm your host, Dan Murrell. Joining me, Lon Harris.
Great to be here.
Thanks for being here, Lon. We are going to talk about Avengers Endgame. It opens this weekend. Of course, as always, I was a nerd and looked at some numbers and facts and figures, and we're going to talk about just how big this opening could be. We know it's going to be big, but how big could it be? We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, let's take a look at the box office, the calm before the storm. And it actually was a calm. It was one of the lower Easter weekends that we've had in several years. It was even for what is traditionally kind of a lull in the box office. This past weekend was even more of a lull, but still some breakout movies to talk about. So let's talk about what was happening at the box office this weekend. The Curse of La Llorona outperformed expectations, $26 million. It was even a little bit higher than the estimates that came in yesterday. That's off a $9 million budget. That's why they make these things, Lon.
Yeah.
Is already doing great.
Yeah, it's I mean, I didn't realize. I don't even know. Did they promote that it was part of the Conjuring universe?
They promoted that it was from the producers of The Conjuring, and they've played very coy about whether it's connected to the Conjuring universe and how it is. If you were to look at this opening as part of the Conjuring universe, it would be the lowest. However, they also did not really promote it as part of it.
Right.
So, and I won't either, in case you're one of those few, or probably a lot of people, but one of the people that have not seen The Curse of La Llorona and want to know if it's connected or how, I'll leave that up to you. But it wasn't hyped necessarily as part of the Conjuring universe, but it was also sort of trying to get a little of that Conjuring.
Yeah, it feels like very late in the game they were also like, oh, by the way, guys, Conjuring universe movie. And I mean, it's valuable to them as another piece of content in that larger chunk of content.
Yes.
Even regardless of what it does at the box office. Like, not expensive to make, and now there's another Conjuring movie.
And the director of this film will be directing The Conjuring 3, as I mentioned in the review. Take from that what you will. But we've talked about it so many times. The reason they make these cheap horror movies is you can make it for $9-10 million, put another $9-10 million, even $20 million into advertising and promotion, and make your money back. We'll talk about La Llorona more when we look at the worldwide, because it is based on a piece of Mexican folklore.
Yeah.
So we'll take a look at how it did worldwide. Also, just in a minute, Shazam dropped 29% in its third weekend across $120 million. It's there at number 2. So it looks like is going to be, by a fairly large margin, the lowest grossing film in the DCEU. We talked about this when it opened. The only thing that's really causing a lot of worry about this film is its lower budget, $100 million. It is also, by a large margin, the cheapest film in the DCEU. I have to be honest, though, it's not going to be a flop in the sense that it's going to make back worldwide and domestically what it needs to not be considered a flop. But when I saw the movie, and this was a couple weeks before it opened, and just talking to people that had seen it and our excitement over it, I'm a little surprised it didn't end up being more of a breakout hit.
Yeah, me too. I saw it early as well, and I was sure this was going to be like a word of mouth. I think it's one of the most fun superhero movies in a while. I do feel like there is word out now on the internet that it is scary for kids. And I'm not saying it's not, but like there are demon monsters in it. There's a little bit of sort of implied violence with them. I've seen a lot of people online talk about how they took their 8, 9, 10, 12-year-old kids and they got a little scared. And I feel like if that word gets out, that might hurt them a little bit. A lot of kids and families are the ones that go see these kinds of movies.
Yeah.
And if they're holding back, maybe let's wait for video and see if it's appropriate.
Yeah. Well, maybe that may have hit the younger gross, and then with the younger the kids go, you're losing a parent's ticket as well. Maybe that hurt it. I did mention, though, when we came out, we talked about the fact that it did have this weekend before Endgame, and the fact that it is the Easter weekend here, that a lot of people had Good Friday off. And it did, like I said, it's 29% drop, which is not a bad drop for weekend 3. So it looks like it was the beneficiary a little bit of those audiences that were out this weekend going to the movies. Another beneficiary of the Easter weekend was Breakthrough, which was aimed at a Christian audience, coming in at third place. That puts it around the area of War Room, which came out in 2015, also aimed predominantly at a Christian audience, although it could not replicate I Can Only Imagine, which opened last year at $17 million and had a great multiple, ended up grossing over $80 million.
Yeah. Does that go back to Passion of the Christ? I feel like that was the first time I remember a movie that was specifically marketed like through churches, through that network, and that had such dramatic success.
One of the first ones.
Yeah.
Definitely. One of the first ones in the modern era. I mean, there's always been grassroots marketing, but as far as like a strategy,
a coordinated campaign, like let's
yes.
get this out to church leaders, let's get the word out among that community, and then to open it again around Easter, which on theme.
Yeah,
you know?
And Breakthrough had a very similar campaign.
Yeah.
Very strong on social media, and you saw that bearing out with its third place opening. A movie that returned to the top 5 this weekend, and actually this is kind of rare. It did not add any screens, but it saw an increase in business, was Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel actually increased plus 6% over last weekend to come back into the top 5. As I mentioned, it lost 322 theaters. Sometimes you'll see a movie return to the top 10 because it'll add theaters, but it looks like this is really almost solely just capitalizing on the fact that there was a pocket of people who had to sneak in under the wire and catch Captain Marvel before Infinity War, because it was plus 6% for the weekend. It also crossed the $400 million domestic mark. That makes it the 7th MCU film to cross $400 million domestically. It is now right behind Captain America Civil War and Iron Man 3. Wow. And it would be, I would say that it's about to jump into the top 5 all time for the MCU domestically, but it would just as quickly be knocked out of the top 5 by the movie we're going to talk about here in a second. But yeah, kind of an anomaly. You don't see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be the Endgame effect. That people are like, now that we're so close, they're like, I got to see all these movies and catch up before.
People are watching all the other films. There's probably a lot of people that were watching the old ones and said, all right, I'm going to end it with either a viewing or a second viewing of Captain Marvel. Yeah. But we saw this last year when Infinity War was opening, which is that Black Panther saw a resurgence as we got closer, because people were saying like, okay, well, I'm going to go and see Black Panther again. I think Disney did actually re-expand it for a little bit.
Right.
And also it had opened about a month earlier, so there's a bigger window there. But yeah, Captain Marvel, the only film in the top 10 to see an increase in business over last weekend. Little dropped 45% in week 2 to round out the top 5 at $8.3 million. Again, very modestly budgeted film. It looks like it's going to return on that investment pretty well. 45% drop is not terrible for a comedy. You might want a little bit more of a hold, especially facing this box office apocalypse that's coming. But anything less than 50% generally in a second week, it's not too bad. You should be pretty happy with that. And just as a note, I was looking at these 4 out of the 5, just to little piece of trivia, 4 out of the top 5 films this weekend had female leads. That's the second time this has happened in the last calendar month. So
there you go.
I think that's kind of cool, and I'm sure you could probably count a lot of weekends that's happened, or probably not very much. So
yeah, certainly before the last few years, not a ton of examples of that.
No, not many examples. One film that dropped out of the top 5, landed at number 10, is Hellboy.
Having a tough time
after a disappointing opening last week. It dropped about 68% in week 2, finishing number 10. That puts it in league with some other superhero films like Four Stick, a.k.a. 2015's Fantastic Four, X-Men Origins Wolverine, Elektra, Hulk, Batman v Superman. And actually, it held better than Hellboy 2. Hellboy 2 had a 70.7% drop on its second weekend, so I guess that's the one thing that they can say that did better than the other Hellboy movies is it dropped fractionally less in its second weekend than the second Del Toro Hellboy.
Right.
So
those Del Toro movies did find an audience over time. You got to wonder if this one's going to do the same.
Yeah, I don't know if it will. We'll see. Let's look at the top. Let's look at the top per theater. Under the Silver Lake opened in 2 theaters this weekend. Took the top for theater at 17,635. This movie's had a weird journey.
Yeah, this is the follow-up to It Follows.
Yeah, David Robert Mitchell.
And it was done like 2 years ago. It was at festivals. A24 picked it up, and then they just buried it.
Yeah, well, the film began shooting in 2016. It premiered at last year's Cannes Film Festival. It was supposed to open last June. Then it was pushed to last December. Then it was pushed to its opening date here in April 2019, and the rumor was reportedly that A24 decided that the buzz was a little mixed coming out of Cannes. They didn't think they could open in the summer off of a big coast off of a huge word of mouth from Cannes. They moved it to December. Then they didn't want to get mixed up with the awards movies in December because they didn't think that it really was ever going to be in that mix, and it put unfair expectations on the movie. So it was pushed again to April. So if you feel like you saw trailers for Under the Silver Lake a couple years ago, you're not crazy. Yeah, you did. It just got pushed and pushed and pushed almost a year back from its
It's fascinating because the reviews, it's not universally panned. Like a lot of the reviews are very very positive, but it's just very all over the place. A very divisive movie.
It's very divisive. I mean, It Follows was
That's
a
true
bit of
as
a
well.
divisive film as well. And
Yeah.
from what I've heard, I didn't get a chance to see Under the Silver Lake. I'm sure that those theaters were in Los Angeles. If you don't know, there's a neighborhood called Silver Lake in
neighborhood.
Los Angeles where Lon lives.
It's
and
set right where I live. It's weird.
if there's anything Los Angelinos love more, it's to be validated by seeing where they live on screen. So
Well, usually we go see where we live on screen, but it's standing in for like Louisville. So it's nice to go see
true.
it, and it's playing itself.
playing itself. Silver Lake as itself. Let's look at the top. Let's go from the microcosm of Silver Lake to the worldwide box office. See what did the best over the weekend. Curse of La Llorona, $56 million, again off a $9 million production budget. It's doing fine.
Doing pretty good.
Shazam at $38 million. Dumbo, 2019's Dumbo at $20 million there. That's having a little bit better legs than it worldwide than it is domestically, but still not a great success story for Disney.
It's a tough sell.
Captain Marvel at number 4, and then Breakthrough mainly off of its domestic opening. There at number 5. Shazam, if you're looking at Shazam, it looks like it's going to struggle to get to $400 million, which, again, we've said it many times, I'll say it one more time. The budget is the only thing that's really saving this from being a much bigger conversation about this movie's performance. Still, I think that Warner Brothers probably had higher hopes for it outside of
Well,
what
especially
it's doing,
because it's sort of this new strategy. Let's see how it works when we stop focusing so much on shared universe and kind of move these characters off on their own. And then it got well reviewed, and it still isn't connecting. That's got to be a little defeating.
Yeah, a little bit disappointing that maybe it didn't find a wider audience. And then the other thing that I was debating was, do you give Disney credit for 2 movies in the worldwide top 5 or 3? Because obviously Dumbo and Captain Marvel count, but Breakthrough is a Fox release. So Disney
picked
had
it up,
either 2 or 3 movies in the top 5 this weekend. And it's going to have one for
Probably
sure.
number 1, I'm guessing.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say at the number 1 spot
Probably.
this upcoming weekend, because Avengers Endgame is hitting theaters this weekend. Day and date almost everywhere in the world. We'll talk about what that means and why that's important in a second. But Lon, let's start by looking at what's at stake here this weekend. I don't think it would be news to anyone that Avengers is going to be one of the top opening movies of all time. So let's look at what the records are right now. What's in line to be contested and or broken by Avengers Endgame. First of all, let's look at the top 5 domestic openings of all time. These are 3-day weekends. Last year, Avengers Infinity War set that record, $257 million, followed by The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, Jurassic World, and The Avengers. You have little Avengers bookmarks there. Avengers
symmetry.
I think it's fairly safe to say that The Avengers is going to get knocked out of that.
Yeah.
Out of that number 5 spot.
If not, let's tune in next week for a exciting charting.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where we're looking at domestically. Let's also look worldwide, what the numbers are worldwide as far as the biggest openings of all time. Infinity War, again, set that record, blew past the record last year.
Wow.
$640 million. Fate of the Furious, largely off of a huge Chinese opening coupled with a U.S. opening at $540 million. The Force Awakens, Jurassic World, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 round out the top 5. Remember this chart because we're going to come back to it in a second, because there are asterisks and caveats and things to add about every single one of those openings that we're going to talk about. But let's look at it. Let's look domestically first of all, and what the prospects could be for Avengers Endgame domestically. And we talk about the fact that it is so difficult to try to track and project and say, well, what is the movie going to do when there's so much enthusiasm and hype behind it? But there are a couple of signposts that you can look at. And one that I wanted to look at is final chapters. There's not a whole lot of franchises that have done this, but when you look at a franchise that is immensely popular, that hasn't really waned as far as box office or popularity, and that is entering what is heavily hyped as the end. While Endgame isn't the last MCU movie, it is, everybody knows, and it is being marketed as, and it is part of the hype around it, is that we know that it is the end for a lot of these characters, for this story. In a lot of ways, this is the end for an entire era.
Yeah, well, they're specifically saying it. It's the Infinity Saga is drawing to a close.
So I wanted to look at how some franchises, if you've seen an increase as you go to these movies that have hit the end, while the franchise is still strong. And there actually weren't that many to pull from. There's been some like The Hunger Games, which lost a little steam as it went. Twilight was always very steady. It didn't really have huge spikes. It didn't really build massively on each one on the next.
And then you've got a lot of franchises that would, Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare it, and we just stopped trusting them. So it's like, Jason's gonna die, but we all kind of know that Jason's not really gonna die. So it's very few where you really trust that this is the wrap-up of this story.
So there were 3 that I wanted to look at just to see how their openings were. And this is compared to the openings of their previous installments. This is how their openings built on the previous installments. Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King opened $10 million higher than the previous installment, The Two Towers. That was about 17% higher. Harry Potter, The Deathly Hallows Part 2 opened about $44 million higher than the previous installment. That was about 35% higher. And then Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, opened about $28 million higher than Attack of the Clones, which was, again, about 35% higher. These are all franchises that were popular, that had had several movies before, but each of these movies were hyped as the end of either an era or a saga or a chapter, and each one of these built on the openings of the film before. So if you're looking at that kind of a build, and let's just estimate 20%. Let's say that Endgame opens 20%, split the difference between a lot of those chapters, and opens 20% higher than Infinity War did. You're looking at just over $300 million. It would be a new domestic record, obviously, since Infinity War holds the last record. And it's a figure that people are saying is potentially in sight. We're going to talk about a Deadline article regarding the pre-sales, but it was reported today that looking at the pre-sales, looking at the hype, looking at how many theaters are playing it and for how many times, the $300 million figure is not an impossibility. The only thing that might hold it back from that is the runtime.
Right.
Avengers is 3 hours long.
It's very long.
Will that runtime keep it from potentially banking a little bit more money?
Yeah, I mean, it's usually that would be fewer showtimes, so you're sort of guaranteeing it's going to make less. I wonder if that's going to be offset by theaters expanding their screening times to accommodate the longer movie. Movie theaters are going to start showing movies a little earlier, maybe stay open a little late, show it around the clock to try to squeeze in more Endgame showtimes. I wonder how much success they'll have offsetting the 3 hour.
The 3 hour run. That's a big question. Also, we were talking, and something that I didn't even think about, but we were talking right before we came on. Game of Thrones has a very much hyped episode premiering Sunday night.
Speaking of big climaxes to which things have been building for a long time.
It's how many potentially, and I don't know anything. I have no spoilers, but just looking at the speculation on Endgame and the speculation on Game of Thrones, come Monday morning, how many beloved pop culture characters might be dead?
All of them, really. I mean, we're looking, it could be complete wipeout of every beloved character.
Should we just call in sick on Monday?
It's going to be a sad day.
Mourning or something?
If Tormund and Captain America are both gone, how do we move on with our lives?
How do our lives continue, Lon?
Yeah, I don't know. That's hypothetical. We have no inside information.
Yeah,
don't get
mad. I don't look for spoilers. I don't want spoilers.
No,
I don't look for them. But
not.
Any combination of it's going to be a very sad day potentially.
I just didn't want anybody watching this like Captain America's dead. I don't know.
We don't know anything.
He might be fine.
We know nothing. Much like Jon Snow, who might die. Who knows?
I feel like he's got a target on his back.
So domestically, I think that the record is in sight. We'll see. We'll see if there are any other factors that sort of mitigate its performance. Let's look. I mean,
one other factor, as we were just saying, there's nothing in its way. There's no movies opening. There's nothing that's open right now that is already doing gangbusters. It's sort of Endgame or nothing.
Game of Thrones is its most significant entertainment competition.
And Netflix.
Exactly, or whatever else people are watching. Yeah. But where it has some real potential, I think, is worldwide. So I mentioned that we're going to caveat those worldwide openings. So JT, if we could look at those top 5 worldwide openings, there's a few things that we have to caveat. Number one, if you look at how these movies open. The Fate of the Furious was, as I mentioned, big in China and big in a lot of other countries, but opened to less than $100 million here in North America / the United States, which means that that's nothing to sneeze at. That's a good opening, but it wasn't a record-breaking opening. So that one was largely bolstered by overseas grosses. If you look at Star Wars: The Force Awakens, that did not open day and date in China. So that number does not constitute an opening in China. And even if it did, Star Wars, as we've talked about on this show, while The Force Awakens did pretty good, is not a huge franchise in China.
Right.
Harry Potter's and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. Did not open day and date in China, and again, while it did well in China, not a huge franchise there. Jurassic World is fairly similar in the sense that it had a good opening in North America, it had a good opening in China, but even the opening that it had overseas, obviously it was a bigger opener here in North America. Infinity War was a bigger opener here in North America than Jurassic World. Infinity War almost doubled its opening in China, Jurassic World's opening in China. So again, that's the only release that is as comparable to what is happening this weekend with Endgame as far as markets it's released in. But the box office draw of the MCU has proven to be much larger in almost every market than Jurassic World. Here's the number that I want to talk about, though, which is that, and a lot of people don't know this, but the number one worldwide opening of all time, as we saw there, was Infinity War. That number does not include the Chinese Open because it did not open in China the same weekend that it opened almost everywhere else in the world. So that set a $100 million buffered biggest opening worldwide without the numbers. If you were to factor in China's opening weekend, that number would be about $830 million. This one is opening in China.
So we could be looking at that kind of a number.
As a matter of fact, it's opening just about everywhere this week.
They don't want the word to get out.
Exactly. Disney, for whatever, however they did it, they've pretty much orchestrated a worldwide release of Avengers Endgame in every single market worldwide. So what are the signposts and what are the tea leaves toward what we might be seeing this weekend? So many people have asked me to talk about pre-sales. How do pre-sales work? What do they mean? Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about that a little bit. First of all, a lot of questions that people ask, and it's true, is like, where does it count the money?
Right.
When they talk about pre-sales, when is that money counted? Well, it largely is counted toward the opening weekend because that's where most people are buying their tickets to go. They're Saturday, Friday, Sunday. Yeah. So when people say like, oh, I bought my tickets 4 weeks ago, like when is that money counted? That money is counted. You probably bought that for opening weekend. That's where that money's counted. If you bought it for 3 weeks after it came out, that's strange, but that's where it counts too.
Want to make sure they got in there at that bargain theater.
A pre-sale, it's not like it is all counted in one bulk thing. It's counted for basically when you bought your ticket to go see the movie, which I would imagine 95% or more of pre-sales will be this weekend. Let's look at some of the facts and figures around pre-sales that have come out over the past few weeks. And I've talked about how it's tough to put these in context because they don't say compared to what, and you don't know what the biggest overall number is. They don't give you a dollar figure, at least for North American pre-sales, although we do have them for China, which we'll talk about. But when you can look in comparison to other movies and try to extrapolate that a little bit. So let's look at what we know about pre-sale so far. First of all, there's a story that ran in Deadline today. This does not come from Disney. This is from their own reporting and their own estimation. They believe that $120 to $140 million in pre-sales have been sold in North America alone. Now, that's just people that have bought their tickets now. This does not include anyone who is going to buy a ticket subsequent to that story being reported and published, which is going to be a pretty big chunk of the movie-going audience. So Deadline estimates that $120 to $140 million of pre-sale tickets have been sold in North America. Fandango announced that Avengers Endgame was their biggest first-day pre-sales in history. Atom Tickets said that when compared to Avengers Infinity War, Endgame sold 3 times more tickets in its first hour. According to Fandango, it sold in its first 7 days 5 times more tickets than Infinity War. Now, that's not total. That just means on their service.
Right.
Keep in mind, things like AMC A-List, particularly AMC A-List, was not around last year when Infinity War came out. That could be a whole other arm of pre-sales that is not being counted because those are numbers that are coming from AMC. I didn't see any numbers as far as they go that say how many tickets that they've sold. But the one that
it's probably comparable.
It's probably
to
comparable.
All of these,
exactly. I mean, these are numbers in comparison to Infinity War that are doing multiples. Endgame is doing multiples compared to those grosses. What does that mean as far as actual dollars? I don't know. I don't know that information, but it does seem to indicate that the momentum for Endgame having a bigger opening for Infinity War is there. But the number that I really wanted to point out is that an Endgame now has the highest pre-sales of all time in China. If you're not following Gavin Feng on Twitter, he's doing some fantastic box office analysis from China, is invaluable, tracking what it's been doing. No movie has sold as many tickets in pre-sales than Avengers Endgame, which means that the $191 million opening that Infinity War had in China, we could be looking at even more. So, looking at the box office this weekend,
it's a lot of money. Man.
There's a lot of money, and we
money.
could be looking at a lot of history. I think it's pretty guaranteed. I think it's more than likely that we are going to break the weekend box office record globally. And the reason that I think globally more than anything that it's going to do this is because when you look at all of those top 5 worldwide openings of all time, they all are sort of syncopated to hit at different beats. Like, oh, Fast and Furious is popular in China but was waning in the U.S. Or, oh, Infinity War did great in the U.S. but didn't open in China. Or Star Wars did great in the U.S. but it didn't open anywhere else. This is really one of the only times that we have seen a series like this, with this kind of hype and popularity worldwide, with this kind of strength that is opening in every country, that is the end, it's almost like a perfect storm of money for Disney and for the MCU.
Yeah.
It would be hard for me to see how you can replicate this kind of thing again. Star Wars, maybe. We'll see what the release plan on that is. But Star Wars, again, hasn't shown the kind of popularity in China particularly that it has here. It's not a franchise. Like, the MCU is one of these like once in a lifetime franchises that is popular everywhere.
And Star Wars, I mean, even episode 9, everybody's looking forward to it. Culmination, ending of a story. That's the culmination of a 3-movie story. We're talking 20 plus chances Marvel has had to hook people on this franchise, and it's all culminating in this one movie. It is fairly unprecedented, I think.
It really is. We talk about money, and everyone's like, oh, there's a new record every week. There's a new, yeah, I get it. Like, there it does. The way that it works, the way that inflation works, it does seem like there's a new record every week. However, as far as what I'm going to be looking at this weekend, I'm going to be looking at the box office numbers worldwide. I'm going to be seeing what it's bringing in from China. Obviously, domestically, it's going to be interesting to me, but I think it's far more likely that it's going to break the worldwide record for opening weekend than domestic. Domestic, just because it's a smaller sample, one country, and it's a longer movie. I still think that's entirely possible, but the global picture and the global story on Endgame is what I really am interested to see coming out of this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked a ton about it, but I feel like spoilers and the hype around, you have to see this right away, or it's going to get ruined for you.
Right.
And maybe Star Wars also has that. Episode 9 has a lot of, like, there's going to be some big reveals you don't want to know. But that's it. I can't think of another movie because Jurassic World, fun, that people aren't tied into it. And stuff like Harry Potter, well, there's a book. You're not
Return of the King.
Yeah, you're not
know.
terrified of being spoiled because, well, lots of people have read ahead and know how it ends anyway.
Yeah.
But this movie in particular is such a point of stress for people. Like, I have to see it before some idiot on the internet tells me what happens.
Yeah.
I do think that's fueling a lot of this mania.
I agree. And I think that that's going to get even more people out and energized to see this movie immediately. So, Lon, you know what we're going to be talking about here next week. Let's just strap in, because it's going to be Thanos and who knows what, and box office bursting out of buttholes everywhere. Like Ant-Man.
And the week will be over and you'll retire to your farm.
Just sit down and smile into the distance.
Just sit peacefully. Yeah.
My work is done. Let's look at before we go, the 2019, the calm before the storm, really. What happens before Avengers takes over the number 1 and number 2 spot on all these lists? Let's look at the domestic list. As I mentioned, Captain Marvel becomes the number 1 movie of the year. I find it very unlikely that Endgame is going to make $400 million in its first weekend. So I think it's going to. I think
That
after
would be
opening
huge.
weekend, it's going to be number 2 on that list. It'll be number 1 probably a few days after that.
Yeah.
But Endgame is going to be on that list. Medea is going to be bumped off of that list. So that's probably how you're going to see that one look. And then looking at the 2019 worldwide box office, this might be interesting. Let's see what happens to this at the number 1 and number 2 spots after this weekend. Captain Marvel, number 1 with $1 billion. I don't think it's...
That's a lot of money to make in one weekend.
Endgame is going to be the second movie this year to make $1 billion. The question is when.
When, right.
And
How
is it
long
going to
will
make
it take?
$2 billion? And how much more is it going to make? So we'll see how that does. And opening this week, come on, if you haven't been listening to us, there's one movie opening this week. It's what we're going to be talking about next week.
Big cast. Half of them are dust.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'll see it.
We're a few short days. I don't go online, and I've heard that, there's rumors of spoilers and everything. You're a few days away.
Yes.
Try to do your best if you don't want to be spoiled.
There was one scene that somebody like bootleg recorded somehow that was out there. Don't look for it.
Don't look for anything.
Don't try to find that.
Don't tell other people that stuff.
Why would you ruin it for everyone?
You can find a non-spoiler review of Avengers Endgame right here on Fandom Entertainment tomorrow.
Ooh,
so watch for that. And otherwise, watch for Charting with Dan. We'll be back next week to talk about what Endgame did.
Endgame.
And we'll be here all week with Screen Junkies Universe with more news and reviews and you name it. Until next time, Lon, thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.